Our panelists today, our first representative, Dan McKay, serving a Utah House Representative for District 41 since 2012. McKay has worked with the Freedom Works Association, and he also has a bachelor's and master's in education from Utah State University and a law degree from Willamette University in Oregon. Next to him, we have Daryl Ackerman, who was born in Washington, D.C., and lived in Utah for 12 years. He is currently the Senior Manager of Digital Strategy Analytics for Hewlett-Packard Corporation. Prior to that, he was the founding member of the Omniture Consulting Services Group, specializing in web analytic best practices. He is the immediate past Vice Chairman of the Utah County Republican Party and a current member of the Utah Republican Party Central and Executive Committees, and chairman of the Utah Republican Black Assembly. Mr. Ackerman currently lives in Draper with his wife and his quote-unquote 2 spoiled children. Next to Mr. Ackerman, we have Rich McKeon, who serves voluntarily as Chief Executive Chair for Count My Vote. He is the Chief Executive Officer for Levitt Partners, which he co-founded with former U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary, Governor Michael Levitt. Mr. McKeon has served with the Levitt Partners as the Chief of Staff for Michael Levitt at the Department of Human Services. From 2003 to 2005, Mr. McKeon served as Senior Counsel and Chief Staff Administrator for Mr. Levitt at the EPA. And prior to his time in Washington, D.C., Mr. McKeon served as Chief of Staff to Governor Levitt and as the Commission for the Utah State Tax Commission. Mr. McKeon's background is in education and law. He received his bachelor's degree from Ohio University and is a graduate from University of Utah College of Law. Our moderator today is Senator Pat Jones. Senator Jones currently serves in the Utah State Senate and has served since 2000 in 3 terms in the House of Representatives and 2 terms in the Senate, 12 of those years in leadership positions. Since 1980, she has been the president of Dan Jones and Associates, Utah's most prominent public opinion and market research firm. She is an expert in quantitative and qualitative research and has over 25 years experience as a focus group moderator. She is a graduate from Olympus High School in Salt Lake City. She has a bachelor's in science, journalism, and communications from University of Utah, magna cum laude, and extensive training in focus group moderating. Give it up for our panelists.
Well, what a great pleasure it is to be here at the Walker Institute. This is the first time I have been here, and I'm so impressed with Weber State University and what you're doing with the Walker Institute. It's a delight to be here with these wonderful panelists and among you. I did want to ask Carol, would you mind just letting me know, stand up or raise your hand when it's time to take Q&A. The format for today is we'll be having the panel discuss some questions that I'll be asking them for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take about 20 minutes for Q&A, and I imagine it'll be a lively and interesting discussion on an issue that everyone should care about. Certainly, there's been a lot of talk about it. I would like to, first of all, ask each of our panelists what their role was and what side they were on during this process of the Count My Vote initiative, and to just kind of give a little bit of an introduction on how they got involved and why they got involved and what role they played.
Thank you very much, Pat. It's great to be here. I love Olene Walker. She was one of the great people to work with as Lieutenant Governor, and I had the privilege of announcing to the Mike Levitt cabinet that she was going to be Utah's first woman governor, and I treasure that moment in time, so it's great to be with you here, and I was born in Washington, D.C. as well. So the involvement of Count My Vote originated in 2009 when Mike Levitt and I returned from Washington, D.C. to Salt Lake City. We had observed over the course of time the decline in voter participation in the state of Utah. 1960s, we were top of nation, always top 5, 80% or so would participate. And by the time we arrived back in Salt Lake City, we were below the national average, right, hovering around 50%. And for a group of people who are among the most educated, the most civic-minded, the most involved in their communities, it just seemed contrary and just a contradiction that we should be so low in voter participation. And we began a discussion with a number of people regarding this issue of increasing voter participation. And we began to focus right on the primary caucus system, which we thought was a limiter to voter participation. There's lots of history behind that, but I'll just say that was our motivating factor. That was the reason that we got involved. We went to the legislature and asked them if they would consider changes that the state could legitimately make. We went to the parties, asked them if there were changes that they would make internally that would, we thought, enhance voter participation by increasing the number of primaries. Neither of those institutions was able to, at that time, despite the fact that they had discussions about it, able to validate or change things. And so we moved to an initiative process. And the role that I played in that was as the executive chair of the Count My Vote process, along with co-chairs Gail Miller, Mike Levitt, and Norma Matheson. I'll pass it to Daryl.
So I'm the lightweight up here. I'm sort of just got involved in politics actively.
Are you calling me fat? I've lost some weight, Daryl. I'm working on it.
I think we're about the same.
Just give me some time. I'm working on it.
I could wear your jacket if you let me borrow it. So I was the vice chairman of the Utah County Republican Party. Just got elected like a year ago. I wasn't hugely involved. I'm a data strategist by trade. I work in technology. And at some point, I realized that the party really needed my help, so I ran. And I'm a big fan of the caucus system. In my speech, I gave a little joke, poking fun at Count My Vote. I mean, I was kind of that guy. But as we were going forward with our engagement strategy to get voters more engaged, more involved, we were sort of annoyed that Mia Love lost to Jim Matheson back in 2012. We wanted to fix that. So we're moving forward, and we had this distraction, this Count My Vote initiative. And there was a lot of attention. It was drawing a lot of resources. And so my particular involvement was, first of all, I said, all right, we got to deal with this. So I appointed a guy to be our response in Utah County to Count My Vote, to stop them from getting their signatures, partnered with the state party to try to get the signature initiative stopped, was involved in some of the weird drama that went on with our response as a party. And then as we were sort of trying to get our ducks in a row as a party to respond to this, and we're quite firing on all cylinders. I was actually the first guy that Kurt Bramble came to when he started floating the idea of this SB 54. After one of the conventions, he just pulled me aside and said, hey, Daryl, let's do lunch. And so we went out to lunch at a little sandwich shop, and he said, listen, I have this idea for this legislation. And he basically spelled out SB 54 for me. And I didn't like it. I still don't like it. But you know what? I'm a realist. I'm an adult. And I said, you know what? I think this is probably the way forward, because it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to win this unilaterally, with all the howitzers blazing. So I told Senator Bramble, listen, tell me what you need. I've got your back, and I'll support you 100%. And that's how I got involved. And since then, it's just been a matter of just listening to folks. I'm not the vice chairman of the county party anymore. I moved to Salt Lake County, had to resign, but that's my involvement.
State Representative Dan McKay. I represent Riverton and Bluffdale as the House sponsor. That's how I got involved in Senate Bill 54. I was nominated by the delegates in January of 2012, the Friday before the legislative session began to take place of Carl Wimmer, who stepped down in District 52, and was nominated then and was appointed then nominated by the delegates. Governor then appointed me to the House of Representatives. I started drinking from a fire hose first thing Monday morning, and went through an election that very next year, or that very next election cycle, and went through this last time. That first time I I won in convention with more than 60% of the vote, and as a result, my Democratic challenger stepped down, and so there was no contest in November, and as a result, I was the representative for 2012-2014. As a direct participant of the caucus convention process, I was an ardent defender and am an ardent defender of the process and of its strength in nominating. In 2012, 2013, as the Count My Vote petition ramped up, I became interested in the argument that we needed to take people who were really interested in voting and take away a process that they were interested in participating in so that people that weren't interested in participating at all could participate. To me, the logical fallacy didn't line up, and further, it seemed self-serving from my perspective before I really knew the sponsors of the initiative and knew the process. It seemed really self-serving that there was this battle for the control of the Republican Party in the state, and one group wanted it and the other group had it, and it was this weird dynamic in the party that I really wasn't aware of until I was elected and saw kind of the internal process of it. Anyways, that's kind of was my foundation. I'm sure we could share the rest of it later.
Thank you. That's very interesting to hear your background and how you gained your passion, each of you, for it. I think it would be helpful for people to know what the new law is and how it changes things. How is it different today than it was before? And how does it benefit the voter, and how there might be some problems with it? Let's start with Mr. Acumen and then go to Representative McKay.
That's not fair, because you helped write the law, so you actually...
Are you sure you want to start there?
I think we should start with you. Why don't you explain the law?
Nothing against Daryl or anything, but I think either myself or Rich might be better at explaining it. The current process, obviously, there's a convention process, and there are delegates that are nominated, and you go to that convention process. That's the process we have today. Today, we now have a dual process where someone in January 1 can begin to collect signatures to qualify to be on a ballot. And depending on the office, they can qualify at different levels. If you are running to be a statewide office, you can get 29,000 signatures. If you are running to be a state senator, like Senator Jones, it's 2,000 signatures. To be a state representative, it's 1,000 signatures. But you have from January 1 until 2 weeks before the convention date for the party, whenever the party is that you're running for, and those dates have to be noticed and out there so everybody knows when those time limits are. But you have that time period to go out and gather the signatures. And you might think that 29,000 signatures is easy to gather. I think Rich would argue that it's not as easy to gather that many signatures as people think it might be. So in that process, that's the signature process. The other process then will be still through the convention process. We'll still meet for our caucus nights. There will still be delegates elected at those caucus nights, and people will go through that process like they always have. And you'll have this dual process that goes on. Inevitably, what will happen is the convention process will produce a nominee, and that person will go to a primary ballot, and the signature process, all of those that chose to go through that signature process, will then also be on the primary ballot next to the convention nominee. And there will be a primary election based on those signatures and based on those people being on the ballot. Currently, if the statute continues the way it is, that the largest vote getter in that primary election will then move on to the November ballot as the primary, or as the party nominee for that seat, whatever it may be. And I think that's the most simplified. Rich, am I leaving anything out?
No, and I want to point out one thing as a consequence of that, though, that when we began to consider the tactic that we wanted to deploy with regards to Count My Vote, we considered whether we should go for a direct primary or create the hybrid system that Dan has just articulated. And at the end of it, when you listen to this explanation of the complexity, we concluded that it would be impossible to persuade people to make a complex system that no one really understands with regards to the caucus system, even more complex with a direct primary, though the solution is quite elegant because it gives party faithful, those that want the caucus process, it preserves that for them, but it also creates now an additional alternative vehicle to the ballot, which is a direct primary, which I believe creates the best of all worlds, given the cultural distinctions that Utah has tried to preserve. The discussion about direct primary is not a new one. It started around the turn of the century, about the time of statehood. And many states went to a direct primary right after the turn of in the 1900s. It's been going on as a discussion for 120 years. If you read the book Bully Pulpit, which is popular now about Teddy Roosevelt, this is one of the issues he talked about. And that is the notion of involving people directly in the primary vote for the candidates that they want to participate in. I'll just add one thing, and that is that this piece of legislation is complex, because it incorporates the language of count my votes that is in fact the law, which creates a direct primary, unless parties elect after January of 2015 to become qualified parties, which allows them to then create the dual track. Does that all make sense?
That was an important. I think that's an important addition. I'm glad you brought that up because I think the key was, how do we create an incentive for people to go through this alternative path, and at the same time give the parties the opportunity to thumb their nose at it completely and say, no, we'd like to go this other route. And I think they have that flexibility.
And we ought to point out too, as you get the microphone, Darrell, that one of the other solutions that became part of the discussions with the legislature and the group from Count My Vote was this. You are aware that the Republicans over the course of time have closed their primary to only registered Republicans. The Democrats, alternatively, have opened their primary to all Democrats and unaffiliated voters. This legislation, if a party elects to become qualified, requires that all parties open their primary ballots to unaffiliated voters, which means that the Republican Party would not be able to restrict itself simply to registered voters. And that is a big change in the system as well.
Now, here's the problem. I'm emotionally attached to the caucus system and very averse to count my vote, right? But again, we're adults and we have to, this SB 54 is about compromise. So on the one hand, speaking from the party perspective, this is infuriating because what's happening now is that the state legislature is telling us, a private organization, who we're going to elect to represent ourselves, which intellectually is absurd to us, right? I mean, if we are the Republican Party, if you choose to affiliate with the Republican Party, then we as a party should be able to choose the people who will represent our party in the next election. And what SB 54 and what Count My Vote basically said is, no. We're going to have folks who are going to go out and they're going to spend money and they're going to get a bunch of signatures and we're going to get 3 or 4 or 5 people on the ballot and we're going to allow people who don't share your values, who don't affiliate with the Republican Party at all. We're going to let them decide who your nominee is going to be, and then that person's going to go in and represent your party in the general, which is absurd. But we have an interesting situation in Utah that I have to concede, and that is, we have 2 major parties. One that's the largest party in Utah County and the second largest in Salt Lake County, and one that's the largest party in Salt Lake County and the second largest in Utah County. And it's not the Republicans and the Democrats. It is the Republican Party and the unaffiliated party. And that's an issue. So intellectually, we want to stick with the idea that we as a party get to choose who represents our party with our values. But when we hold that line, we're disenfranchising a larger and larger group of voters. And it's a unique situation to Utah, and you've got to find a way to address it. And that's the first thing, or the last thing actually. He brought this up after our sodas that Kurt Bramble said. He said, "Look, we got this thing," and I said, "Yeah, sounds great." He says, "Oh, by the way, the Count My Vote guys are going to want to open up the primary and let unaffiliateds vote." And intellectually, I'm opposed to that. It drives me crazy. But in Utah, unfortunately, there's no other way around it. Unless you can bring unaffiliateds into the party, which is just a long-term, difficult struggle that I've worked on from an engagement perspective, you have to figure out a way to incorporate them. And SB 54 with the open primary accomplishes that.
Mr. Acumen, I wanted to follow up on your question. As I campaigned in my 5 elections, I found a number of Republican voters that were unaffiliated, but were furious that they had to actually register to vote. How would that actually might help Republicans if it is open to everyone?
Honestly, I think that we're sidestepping an issue when we talk about unaffiliated voters and Count My Vote and how it impacts them, because the real problem here isn't whether or not the primary is open. I mean, that's a symptom of the problem. It's not, whether you want a caucus or a primary. The real problem is that the Republican Party in particular, at a state level and at a national level, has a difficult time engaging with voters. When I ran for vice chair, I actually said that, there's a book Richard Rummelt wrote, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, The Difference in Why It Matters. And there he explains that strategy is understanding your strengths and your weaknesses and applying your strengths in a creative way to generate leverage. The Republican Party, nationally and at a state level's greatest strength is that we're, the majority party, and we can call almost every voter in the state and find out what they think and talk to them, and they'll answer the phone and they'll give us their opinions. Our greatest weakness is that we're the largest party in the state, and we don't bother to call every voter in the state and ask what they think and get their opinions because we just don't care. We assume that they think exactly what we think. And that creates apathy from a leadership perspective, which means we aren't engaging, which creates apathy from a voter perspective. And that's the real problem. You could argue that opening up the primary will improve voter involvement, but really the problem is that the party itself has done a really bad job at engaging voters at an individual level.
Well, I think one of the things we've got to look at is that a lot of this chatter is about whether or not an elite small group of people should elect our candidates in a one-party state, basically, or whether this should be done by the entire population. Do we have confidence in this population or don't we? The Republicans have, by virtue of their decisions, they have narrowed that. They have fought fairly vigorously to retain the caucus system. The caucus system in and of itself elects delegates on a single night, and those delegates who represent 0.6% of Republicans and 0.3% total of the entire state voting population age are represented by this small elite group. And James Madison addressed this very early on, and that was that small elite groups will lead to voting mischief. And the fact is that what we have done in Count My Vote is we have tried to, in every respect, initiate things that would open this up to the public and let the public vote. It seems to me that it is really hard to say that a smaller group of elite, smart people can do a better job than all of us. And that's the bottom line. And I just one thing that Darrell mentioned, I just want to point out as a correction, and that from my perspective at least, was that the open primary, unaffiliated voters, was not a Count My Vote initiative. That was a tweak initiative done by those that we talked with in the legislature. That was their desire.
So let me just add a couple of nuances to that. He's right. I think that did come from a legislative perspective from adding the unaffiliated, and I can't remember where its genesis was. But I want to add to Darrell's comments. Remember, his frustration is not just his frustration. His frustration is shared by the Democratic Party in this state as well. It's not isolated to the Republicans. If you look for leadership from the Democratic Party, they shared the same concerns and same frustrations historically in adding the Count My Vote or changing the Count My Vote. While not as ardent and not as outspoken, there were joint press releases, there were joint statements. Both party chairs at the time were concerned about the initiative and were concerned about its process. So it wasn't necessarily just, Darrell speaks out of it from a Republican perspective, and I kind of wish we had Senator Backus here to share that as well. We don't, so you'll just have to take my word for it, I guess.
I'll speak for Jim.
Yeah, I mean, he was pretty adamant also. But Rich makes an interesting argument that the small elite in the caucus system were making the decisions. If you read a book called Republic Lost, it's by Robert Lessig, former member of the House of Representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives. He writes about how a small elite group, if you do the percentages, that most of the political money in this country is coming from 3 to 5% of the population, maybe less. And if you talk about a small elite group, making elections more expensive, and by expensive, let me add to that, a primary race where you have 3, 4 candidates, 2 candidates on a ballot is an expense. It's an additional expense that would not be there if someone won at the convention process and was the party's sole nominee. For example, in plenty of races throughout the state, in both the Democratic and the Republican side, the nominee that avoids the primary wins by well over 70 and some 80 to 85% of the delegates. It's not even close. So, but now, that candidate, who was a not even close candidate, well landslide win, now needs to go and fundraise to raise money to participate against an anonymous primary person who will also be putting, retail politics, which is my biggest concern, and honestly, Robert Lessig's concern in this book, which is retail politics is taking over. No longer is politics about sitting down and having a conversation about policy and about what we believe in. It's about the color of your yard signs. It's about the look of the candidate, which has benefited me thus far. It's about the look of the candidate, and it's about how much money they can raise. That's retail politics. Look at our debates. Nowadays, we don't have firesides where people sit by the radio and listen to conversation and debate. Instead, they're looking for 90-second sound bites where they're dissecting a candidate's entire philosophy based on a 90-second or even less soundbite about that candidate. You are deeper than that. I am deeper than that. And I'm offended by our politics winnowing its way down to this person is a Tea Party, ridiculous right-wing candidate. Or this person is a complete abject liberal and they don't represent Utah. That offends me. But that's the process that comes with greater primaries, more primaries in the state. And what can't be lost is that I raise money for my races, and my races this year will probably cost between $15,000 to $20,000. I could win, I could lose on $15,000 to $20,000. In 2016, I think my budget for that race will go to $80,000 to $90,000 for that race. The only thing that's different is I'm planning on a primary challenger. And I take those numbers based off of the surrounding states around us. Oregon, Washington, Nevada, all the others that have these direct primaries, to get elected to the state Senate or the state House of Representatives, their numbers are plus 100,000 with a similar size constituency. So the problem is you're choosing one over choosing the other. And my argument for the caucus convention process, while there is a different elite, I'm not saying they're not elite, and I'm not saying that the money fundraising crowd isn't elite either. I'm just saying it's a different elite. And the different elite is there are people that live in that exact neighborhood and they're participating on an elected night. They care enough to show up on that night. So all the ardent, strife and frustration that comes over the caucus convention process, at least these crazy people that are perceived to be far extreme opinions on either side of the parties, at least they live where the representative or the senator or the city council or whatever, or sorry, they don't represent city council, but whatever the partisan races are, at least they live there, which is a different elite than what we currently are changing in our system for. And so I'll just argue that when we look at the process, we have to argue not that one is better than the other. We're just deciding that this trade-off, i.e. the money elite, is more valuable and or different and or better than the caucus convention elite. And that's been my complaint about the initiative the way it was, at least under Senate Bill 54. We've at least preserved the process where someone can get on the ballot through the convention process because their citizens, wanted them to be there through the delegate process, and or now the signature process, which also requires people living in that district. So anyway.
If this is about money, then let's do campaign reform, and what we basically do is say that donate what you want, but make sure you post it within 24 hours of the time it's received, and that's a simple approach to the money thing. The difficulty with the caucus system with regards to its expense is that the expense in 2012, 6,000, or maybe 2010, it was $2,700 paid per delegate of the 2,700 Republicans and the 3,700 Republican delegates and 2,600 Democrat Republicans.
Rich, from an academic perspective, if you just subtract out Senator Hatch's race, how much would that be?
Well, but you can't subtract it out. It was money that was spent to influence delegates, not the general public, and it was done with pamphlets, with targeted publications. That money, in my argument, should be spent among us, so that we are all informed the same and have the opportunity to vote just as the delegates are. They are showered with attention and affection in order to get votes. It's just an obscene amount of money that goes to individual participation of the delegates.
My last convention race, Rich, $200 across 129 delegates. I bought no meals. I bought all those things. So if you subtract out the Senator Hatch race, which I argue you have to, because Senator Hatch spent an inordinate amount of cash, no question, right? But it was a lot of money for that one race.
Representative McKay, I think I'd like to move on to the Count My Vote process. We saw in the polls that Count My Vote was well on its way to succeeding. I mean, the polls in last December showed that 65% favored Count My Vote, a direct primary, and a large number didn't know. They really were uninformed. So the question that I would have to all of you is, why did Count My Vote compromise? Why don't they just keep proceeding, going ahead? For the other people, Representative McKay, I would love to be a fly on the wall to see, as someone, a very conservative Republican in the House, how you jumped on board. If I were a fly on the wall, what would we have heard and seen? Let's go to you after we go to Mr. McKean.
Well, let me give you the 3 or 4 things that led to the settlement. First of all, you pointed out, Senator Jones, that 65 to 70% routinely in polls favored Count My Vote. That is a direct primary. There are other numbers that are relevant to that as well. We encountered that we actually had signed signatures from about 115,000 people. It was between 110 and 120. We needed 102,000 signatures stretched out over the state, 10% in 26 of the 29 Senate districts. It's a very onerous task, and we were close to getting that. But we were also spending about $150,000 a week to get those signatures done by paid professionals. It's exceedingly expensive. The fact that you go to any election puts an initiative at jeopardy. And we've seen initiatives that have gone up or down depending on this. And at the end of the day, by virtue of the solution that was arrived at by Count My Vote and by Senator Bramble and Representative McKay, as we talked this through, it gave us every of the solutions that we wanted. In addition, it added the unaffiliated voters in the Republican Party. It made no sense not to stop. We were really about $500,000 or $600,000 away from getting the geographic spread that we needed, but the risk was enough there that we just concluded it was time to get a solution, and we thought all Utahns would agree with. And I have to tell you that at the beginning of Count My Vote, we spent 3 months of negotiation trying to decide whether to go exclusively for direct primary or to go for this hybrid kind of approach that became the law of SB 54. Concluded that we could not explain it adequately, but there were people with sentiment who thought that this solution was exactly what we aspired to in the beginning.
See, the irony is that the Count My Vote campaign was an example of exactly what we were fighting about. So the Count My Vote positioned this as, oh, it's the people, it's the people out there, and we represent the people, and you guys are the elites, when the reality is the money was supporting Count My Vote. So here you had a campaign, a signature initiative. You guys are spending $160,000 a week. You started with $500,000. All the big donors in the state were going on board, right? I mean, the state party was getting starved of fundraising, literally. I've seen the budgets, millions of dollars, just gone. Donors weren't giving it to the state party anymore because they were giving it to Count My Vote. And then you had little teeny Utah County. And what did we do? I think we gave $4,600 to an anti-Count My Vote initiative to combat them at UVU. Now, these guys were paying interns at Utah Valley University every day for 3 or 4 months to sit there and collect signatures, paid signs, the whole nine. All we wanted was a little table to compete with them. We spent $4,600 and had a huge fight over it. It was a big battle. I mean, it was a big deal. We were being outspent, 100 and something to 1? That's the kind of retail campaigning that Count My Vote was counting on. Because here's the deal. Yeah, we're talking about a smaller group of people when you talk about the delegates. But in this day and age, it costs a lot of money to reach 1.5 million voters. And guess what that means? It means guys like Jason Chaffetz and Daryl Acumen and Mia Love have no chance to get involved. Because unless you're starting with 6 and 7 figures out of the gate, you have absolutely no shot at surviving in a primary. So the Count My Vote initiative was exactly a perfect example of what was happening. The grassroots, the people who showed up at their caucus meeting, decided to get involved, ran as a delegate, convinced their neighbors to vote for them and went. And then somebody paid a couple $100 and couldn't even afford to buy them dinner, took them to Denny's, said, buy your own food. That guy had a shot with the caucus system. And that system almost got trounced by millions and millions of dollars. And I'm a Republican, right? I'm a capitalist. I mean, there's nothing wrong with money. But the point is, do we want to shut out the small guys who can't afford to compete because they're not well funded? And the Count My Vote initiative and how close it got is a beautiful example of what we're in for. Well, what we would have been in for if Count My Vote had gone through purely.
Let me just respond on that, because the fact of the matter is that the system that Utah has adopted for initiatives is the most onerous in the country. It requires 10% of the voters in the last election in 26 of 29 Senate districts. It is a nearly impossible task. We did that on about half of what other initiatives have spent to accomplish that objective. Now, I think it's appropriate for it to be difficult to get an initiative. We don't want to become California, which is driven by initiatives. On the other hand, it's important to have a process where the people can speak. When 65 or 70% of the people say this, isn't it appropriate for those that can afford it to step up and change a system to be inclusive as opposed to exclusive? That's the bottom line of Count My Vote.
I've lost what the question was, Senator Jones.
Let me go back to my previous question, which was, we're all flies on the wall. How did you, as a conservative member of the House and of the Republican Party, how were you convinced to actually be the sponsor, the House sponsor of this bill?
Well, I was the House sponsor of the bill as of the summer before the session, so it wasn't necessarily a new issue for me. It was, the whole solution of where the bill was originally was a harebrained idea that Senator Bramble and I had, and we decided it would be better to start it in the Senate from a strategy perspective and trying to push it through. When you look at, how you get a crazy right-winger like me involved in a bill like that, I think that's really what Pat's asking. She's asking in a really nice way, though, so I really appreciate that. I'm maturing as a lawmaker, and I hate to admit that in a public forum, so as long as you guys promise to never hold that against me, that we actually mature in office and gain experience and wisdom from watching those who've been there a long time and also watching the process. Because when I was elected, I thought I was going to go start the place on fire, right? And burn down all government, and how do I stop this, constant deal? And not that that's not still a little piece of me, but there's also a point that you realize when you're elected that you need to solve tough problems. Even if they're inconvenient for you and your personal, view on the way things ought to be or where they shouldn't be, you still need to solve tough problems. You still need to, despite being the, some badge of honor, some call it an insult, but I vote no the most on on legislative bills during the session. I just vote no a lot. It's a joke, so I see my colleagues here, I mean, sometimes they'll tape over my yes button because they say, well, you're just not using it this year, so maybe, maybe you won't need it. That doesn't always work, right? You've got to sit at the table and you've got to sit there and address hard situations. And in a lot of respects, I think this was an opportunity for me as a lawmaker to really to grow and to learn from the process. And when I looked at the landscape of the way the issue was being painted, I knew that if I was a sponsor, House, Senate, whatever it may be, that you're going to be involved in the conversation. And that at the end of the day, you get an opportunity to speak for your constituents and more heavily the people of the state who care dramatically about the issue and are very interested and want to make sure good policy is enacted. And to me, that's why I got involved, is because I thought this was an opportunity to show some leadership and to be involved in an important discussion. And I would argue that aside from the budget and a few other issues, this was a very important issue in the state that we dealt with this last year.
Did the public opinion polls and the fact that they were very close to getting the signatures they needed, did that influence your decision to go ahead and be part of it?
I'm a much more, how about this? I've seen polls, my goodness, I think if I polled all the kids in my students, my kids' elementary school class on whether or not they wanted soda in the water fountain, I'm pretty sure I could answer the question in such a way to get the response that I'm looking for. If I'm on one side of the issue, I'm pretty sure I could get them to say, I want them to have soda in the water fountains because it's healthy, or I could get them to say the other. So from my opinion, polls don't really, I mean, there are scientific backups for those things, but we can see going into election day how, certain candidates, Mia Love had a 15% or 20% advantage over Jim Matheson in this last election, and we saw that didn't play out. And while that may be anecdotal, I think we as a society are being sloppy somewhat in accepting polls for reality. So my answer to the answer was whether or not polls, no, polls didn't really play into my consideration. I was more interested in what's good policy and how can we make a system win-win for those who were really interested in the process.
Thank you for trashing my profession.
I promise it's not personal.
As we look to the next legislative session, there is some talk about tinkering with this law. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, what should happen, what will happen, what are you hearing, what should the public look for? Let's start with Mr. McKean.
We've heard two or three things. One is that we've heard that there will be a constitutional challenge that will be litigated. Those that we've spoken to says it's imminent, and that there certainly is a potential for an affected party to be able to bring that kind of litigation to challenge the constitutionality of it. I think it is fairly bulletproof, and the severability clauses that are part of it will, I think, preserve and protect the most important component pieces regarding direct primaries. So based on that, the fact that when we did count my vote, we had a very significant legal opinion done, and that 15 bipartisan bar presidents passed, had signed on as to the constitutionality of that fundamental piece. So that challenge, I think, will be withstood. I think that there is the potential that the legislature could modify, change, tweak, or amend in some way the Count My Vote legislation, SB 54. There are two components to it. There are the component pieces that require a party to adopt as a qualified party, and then there's the underlying Count My Vote piece. It seems to me that legislatures have the option and capacity to go in and change these things at any time, but I would caution them with these numbers. Number one, 115,000 Utahns actually signed petitions. Polls represented that 65 to 70% supported this legislation. And I think those are important factors. The fact that, too, it was passed by a Republican legislature, both House and Senate, and signed by a Republican governor, leads me to conclude that they will trifle with this only at their own peril, and that they will let this thing play out for a couple of seasons to see how it works. That's my recommendation, and that's my open expectation.
If I had $2 or $3 million, I could get 115,000 signatures too. Look, I think, you know, I'm not a legislator. I'm not even an elected member of the party right now. So my opinion of what's going on in the legislature really isn't terribly relevant. From a state Republican Central and Executive Committee perspective, you know, we're more interested in, and I don't know that the final decision has been made to go forward with the constitutional challenge, but that rests with the chairman. But the executive committee is very interested in whether or not a state legislature can force a party to relinquish its authority to decide its own nominees, who's going to represent it. We believe philosophically, fundamentally, that we have the right to pick our representatives. We hold our values. We know what we stand for, and to farm that out to people who don't even think enough of our values to check the R box on their voter registration form, to me is abhorrent. And that's a lot of the members of the EC and the Central Committee feel the same way.
Those are all very interesting. I know that. I think the party, you know, it's interesting. I'm just trying to gather my thoughts. These two gentlemen are very smart, and I appreciate their insight into what they're looking at. I think the lawmakers that are interested in the process are looking at, well, what's good policy? Every year we have to address what's good policy. What's good policy? How does this evolve? You've got half of the Senate and an entirety of 75 representatives who are out knocking doors right now. Well, you know, should be. One of them is sitting up on the stage and, you know, probably should be knocking doors. But they're getting familiar with their electorate, right? And that election process is something we hold sacred just as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some tinkering, and I wouldn't argue that there's much peril. Because at the end of the day, the peril is always at the ballot box, right? And the peril is on the elected officials. And in my opinion, that's good. They should be in peril on a regular basis. They shouldn't be in peril based on a poll. They shouldn't be in a peril based on the money that's involved in the deal. That shouldn't be the threat or the frustration that they, or the concern that they have. They shouldn't be watching out for their own hide. They should be out there talking to people, garnering support. I've made in my own election, I've knocked on at least 2,500 doors, and probably as many phone calls in the last few weeks, right? So I've got a pretty good sense of what the people expect me to do in the district I live in. So I'm just going to respond to them, and that's really my key responsibility. But let's add to it this other question of the constitutionality of the litigation, or whether or not the litigation should go forward. Shouldn't it? I mean, shouldn't if a private organization like a church has a concern with a policy and how it affects them, shouldn't they exert the strength of their membership to challenge that policy? Shouldn't a private group that's being infringed for whatever their race, creed, color, content, whatever it may be, and if they have a private concern about something the government is doing to them, shouldn't they have the obligation to their membership to reach out and challenge? That's number two. And number three, the issues that I think will get tinkered with. There's a plurality problem. There could be 10 people on the ballot next time for the Senate race for the Senate seat that's up in 2016. There could be. I don't imagine that will be the case, but that could be the case. And in that scenario, it seems like we, as a state of Utah, wouldn't want someone to go forward from any party with a 19-20% approval from their own party. That seems dangerous. it seems like we might want to deal with that. There are several tools. One is another runoff election with the top 2 ballot getters, so that one of them at least gets, higher than 50%. There is, another solution one of the other states does is they send the top vote getters back to a convention nomination process, and then the parties have some say in that process. But there's some way to deal with plurality, and if everyone will remember, I'm certain you do because you were all riveted for that Sunday afternoon press conference. That was something from the very beginning we've said, hey, we need to deal with plurality, and that's certainly an issue. The number of signatures in rural counties, getting 1,000 signatures in certain rural counties can be very difficult. If you think of the geography, that might require that's a concern for a lot of our rural counties, especially when you're dealing with offices like sheriff, district attorney, or county attorney, whatever it may be. And so I can understand that. And so I think there will be some minor things. Now, outside of those 2 things, I'm not sure what else would come forward. I would consider them in good faith on their policy measures, but I know the commitment I made when we were negotiating on the process, and it's not going to be from me.
I think it's time to go to Q&A right now. So we would like to invite anyone. There are 2 microphones here. If you wouldn't mind stating your name and who you're with, and direct your question to the person you would like to answer. Senator Weiler.
Hi, I'm Todd Weiler. My question is specifically for Darrell Acumen, and the question is this. Does your camp in the Republican Party, and I maintain there's at least 3 parties in the Utah Republican Party, but does your camp give any credit to the legislature for preserving some form of the caucus system? And let me just explain the context of that question before you answer. I voted for Senate Bill 54 as a member of the Utah Senate, but only after I gave several impassioned speeches against Count My Vote. It was a flawed petition. The only small elite group that I know of are the 28 people that donated, that $500,000 to get that started. And I think Count My Vote ran one of the most politically dishonest campaigns that this state has ever seen. But I voted for the compromise to preserve some form of the caucus system, which I think has merit. And yet what I found is I've only pushed Rich McKeon out of the oncoming bus for me to get hit by it. So I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, you're right. There are at least 3 or 4 different camps in the Republican Party, especially in the Utah County Republican Party, and I have to be very careful and make sure that I beat up on Count My Vote sufficiently so that I don't get crucified by the extreme right-wing group who already think that I'm a liberal. But from my perspective and the leaders that I've spoken to, and I think the bulk of delegates, while I was vice chair, I spoke to every precinct chair in Utah County, about 300 plus people and a couple hundred vice chairs. I was on the phones constantly. And the sentiment that I felt, correct or incorrect, was that folks gave the legislature a lot of credit. Those of us who had done the math, who had done the analysis, who looked at the numbers, had pretty much come to the conclusion that this is something that we probably couldn't win. We didn't have the funding. We didn't have the muscle. They had the television ads bill. We just didn't have the resources to win this. And the legislature, and this is the substance of the conversation I had with Kurt Bramble over lunch. He said, look, Darrell, the writing's on the wall. You're an analyst. Do the math. I said, look, I have regression analysis. Yeah, we're going to lose. So, and he said, this is the solution. This is the path forward. I gave him a lot of credit for that, and I think a lot of Republicans did as well. They're not the loudest, and so you'll hear a lot of people who are, string them all up, but they're a very small group, and they're, disproportionately loud.
I'd just simply say I would try to defend the integrity of the people who worked on Count My Vote. Gail Miller and Norma Matheson and Mike Levitt are among the most noble people I know, and were motivated by virtue of the very thing that we discussed, which is voter participation. If there's dishonesty in that, I'd like to know where it is, but I would just tell you that I believe we have made changes that will benefit Utah for decades to come. There are 45 states that have systems that are direct primary related, They elect candidates from all spectrums, and they have done just fine, and many of them don't have runoffs. Mike Leavitt, when he was elected governor, was elected in the final election with 42% of the vote. I think those of us who supported him and those who supported others would still say that as a governor he did a fine job, and I would just, like I say, defend the integrity of those who were involved in this.
Let's go to Rich Kendall.
I'm Rich Kendall, a proud alumnus of Weber State University, and I currently live in Davis County. And I want to speak to defend Senator Jones's profession.
Will you speak on lawyers next? Because that'd be great too.
The price you would
politicians.
pay is very high. You did a survey within the last several years. You either did it or you did it for another organization, but you polled the general public. And then you polled the delegates. There was no correlation in what they ranked as Utah's biggest priorities. Case in point, if you did a survey today, let's say of 1,000 people in Utah, they'd probably list the funding and support of public education as their #1 priority. It would not even show up on the delegates list. So the two biggest parties are not the Republican Party and the unaffiliated. The two biggest parties are the delegates and Republicans. Now, I'm a lifelong Republican, and two of you are going to need Valium right now, so get a glass of water. And
I took it before I came in, so we should be all right.
I'm a moderate, mainstream Republican. I served with Governor Walker. I served with Governor Leavitt. I consider myself to be mainstream. This system has marginalized me. There's no place for a guy like me. So, can anybody explain to us why the delegates and the general public would have such widely different agendas for advancing the purposes of the state? Thank you. That was kind of a long answer.
Was there a question in there?
Why there's disparity.
Why are the delegates of the general public on different planets?
I was just going to stand and give a standing ovation. I think that the disparity is one of the points to be made here, and that is that the education in the general public is #1 issue, routinely and regularly. When they polled it in the 2010, I think delegates, I think even in 2012, it came up number 11 or higher as among the delegates. Getting out of the UN, number 7 was higher than that. There is a disconnect, and it does marginalize. It marginalizes those that weren't able to go to caucus meeting to the night, those who are business travelers, those who are home with children, those who are military, or those who had professional obligations aren't able to participate. We not only marginalized, but what we do is we refined in a big way the limitation we imposed on people to vote. And this opening it up to all of us will remove that marginalization and allow people who consider themselves to be mainstream on both parties to do things they haven't felt comfortable to do previously.
So first of all, the reason there's a disparity on the education vote, and this is something Count My Vote brought up all the time, but the fact of the matter is the delegates don't vote for the Board of Education, right? They don't. They don't vote for the local board. They don't vote for the state board. It's not an issue that they have to deal with. They're electing, congressional representatives, state legislatures. It's not an issue. It's right. Most of the Board of Education votes are nonpartisan. So we're talking about Republican Party delegates, and you're talking about offices that are not partisan. They're not expected to put education as #1. #2, we made a lot of reforms at the executive committee level, right, in the face of Count My Vote, to make it easier for people who are serving in the military, who have professional obligations, who have children, et cetera, to participate. I don't think we get any credit for that as a party, but there was a lot of discussion about that. Sure.
I was out of it because I was on an LDS mission. Sorry for that. But
Me too.
you are the super school board. I mean, it's disingenuous for you to say,
Oh, come on.
well, we're not in favor of
Why,
all of these
when did we
like
vote on
laws.
the school board issue?
You will put 200 new rules and regulations on the table.
You do fine. Well, but we're talking about
You will
selecting candidates,
micromanage
not what
every
we do after
school
they're
district
elected
in
for
this
office.
state.
ham and eggs.
So how you can call yourselves mainstream or even radical Republican and have no faith in school boards, no faith in community councils, no faith in county commissions? I don't get it. Why don't you just...
Why do you think I vote no so frequently? So I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you. My goal this year is to get to 25%. I was at 15% last year. I was a little disappointed in myself that I didn't get over 20. That was my goal. You make a great point, and I take nothing away from it. Education is absolutely a top priority. Why that disparity exists, I don't know. I can't address, I'm not familiar with the polls, the methodologies, or whatever, but I can understand there is a perception that there's definitely a disparity between the interests of one group and the interests of the other. And I would argue that potentially, don't know this for sure, just guessing. So, but one of the reasons for the disparity is the delegates sit in a one-on-one conversation or a five-on-one conversation with their elected official, and it's interesting. Their elected official tends to tell them what they think is important. It's amazing how the delegates tend to absorb that information and mirror that as well.
If I
Not
could
saying
just,
it's bad.
if I could just interject, as maybe stepping out of my role for a minute, but 75% of the delegates are men, and they tend to be older. And when you measure public opinion and you ask them what their major issues are, older men tend to rate education a little less important. So that would be a very important part of that. Thank you. Let's go to this gentleman.
Okay, my name's Noel Knighton. I'm the chairman of the Weber County Republican Party, and we're empowered to run the caucus and convention system here in Weber County. We have 160 precincts and all over the county. We elect 282 state delegates. Of our 4,000 delegates, I think we should get credit for 4,000. And those people aren't elite. They are men, women, college students, so forth. My question is about this private organization that's come into question about this law dictating to the party how we do business and what bylaws we run under and whether that question should be answered. What points of law are defending SB 54 and Count My Vote that give them the authority and the legal standing to dictate to a private organization how we do business?
The law is pretty well founded at the constitutional level and allows the parties to determine how they will nominate their candidates, but it also allows the state or the federal government to mandate how elections are conducted. I think you won't find much argument when you read the Supreme Court opinions. They are well founded, they are well established, and they have been routinely quoted on a regular basis. I've got a 45-page opinion I'm happy to send to you if you'd like to see that, but that would represent the Count My Vote in its entirety, not the legislation, which also passed through the constitutional note process at the legislature and was determined to be constitutional there at that level.
Okay, thank you.
Go to our next questioner.
Okay, so my name is Matthew Bell. I live in Weber County. So one of the things that Mr. McEwen brought up at first, we were talking about we want better participation. We want more voter turnout. And you put this together, you and Mike Levitt, when you got back to the state, saw some things have gone awry, brought it to our attention to try to fix some of these things. My concern is that we don't force people to vote up to now. Now, we have, when you left, I don't know how many voting options there were, but now they can vote by mail. We send it right to their house. They can study, they can make phone calls, they can go to a caucus or to a voting location in 10 days. They can vote on the day of if they want to get their sticker on their shirt. There is a lot of options for people to get out and vote. And they can do a no vote. They can do a vote and make their card. So what it sounds like is we want to force people to vote. And I don't know that we want to force them to vote. For some reason, they don't want to vote. They don't want to stand up. They're not apparently dissatisfied with the type of government they're getting. You hear these polls that they're not happy with their representative of Congress. That's true. In general, they're not. But ask about our individual representative. And then all of a sudden that poll goes through the roof. We're really happy with our guy, but we're not happy with the national guy. So I think that that's a little misleading where we've given everyone the opportunities to vote. In our county, we give them a lot of opportunities. They choose not to. And we cannot force them to vote. And if we take it out and just go to a media and just with people with money, they are going to see nothing else. They're not going to see other candidates and what other opportunities they could have out there. And this one-on-one, I just think, is very important. So.
Thank you for your question. That, I think that it doesn't necessarily address, though, the causal connection between voter apathy and voter turnout. The things that you mentioned are entirely appropriate. I think Count My Vote would be entirely consistent with I-voting, with vote by mail, and some of those systems are creating astounding turnouts in the precincts where they're requiring vote by mail. They're changing their dimension from 30% to 60 and 70%. And isn't that a wonderful thing to have happen? But the point that I think Count My Vote makes is that the caucus system doesn't permit every option that you've just described. It requires physical attention. It requires that you be in town the night that the caucus is held and that you attend if you are able to. And there are so many people who are unable to attend those caucus meetings that they're marginalized. So I would, let's have an interesting dispute about that.
One of the points, I'm sorry, can I, real quick. So one of the points that Count My Vote used to bring up is that, voter participation was going down. And I remember once they quoted a number, it was like 56%, which is a national number. Of voter turnout. And I always thought it was funny because they would always take the number based on eligible voters instead of based on registered voters. So when I was running the numbers on registered voters, just out of my own database, I was coming up with numbers, and I'm sorry for the notes, but Republicans in the 2012 general election, 84.85% turnout. Among absentee voters, 91.18% turnout. In Salt Lake County, among Republicans, 88.09% turnout. This is 2012 general. I don't think the problem is turnout. The problem is engagement, making sure that the parties know how to engage voters. And we have a challenge with the unaffiliateds because, they're not affiliating with us. It's how do you reach out to them? And we need to work on that. But I don't think the question is turnout. I think it's you need to pivot it a little bit. It's about how do we engage better.
Okay, we're going to take the final 4 questions, and let's start over here. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Gary Johnson. I teach in the political science department here. Benjamin Franklin said that democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what's for lunch, right? Turnout is the issue.
Can I be a
We
wolf?
have the lowest turnout in the country here because, of course, we don't have competitive elections. I think the underlying theme of Count My Vote and all of this is party competition and vigorous election processes. The vice chair of the Republican Party says that this is no issue. We shouldn't have to worry about who votes in Utah, but we do. And the policies that we get 3 shades of gray in the Republican Party are not real choices for voters. And voters don't vote in this state because they know their vote doesn't matter. That this is a one-party state and it's monolithic. How could we get our system to be more competitive and get both parties a chance to voice their policies?
Great question, and well thought out. Seriously, thank you, because it kind of echoes what my primary concern has been in Utah as well, which is this lack of competitiveness or this lack of involvement also, and lack of engagement. I think all of those are symptoms of the large problem, which is, boy, this is a tough, it's a tough state. It's tough issues. How do we get leadership? How do we get all these things together? And since you're a political science professor, I can, you'll pardon me if I'll reach out to his terms. But remember, the era of good feelings, everybody thought political parties were dead in 1815. And everybody thought at the end of the day that the partisanship divide and the way that things were going in the country when Monroe was elected was a completely different change that the country had involved and embarked on this New Deal. And then 8 years later, everybody's jokingly calling it the era of good feelings because everyone knows at the end what a ridiculous proposition that was, right? I think our concerns about involvement, engagement, et cetera, are cyclical and they're issue-based. As as an issue flames to the front, you have people that show up as ardent supporters and frustrated and concerned about that issue, and they vote. 2010 was probably one of the most recent evidences of that, and it had been a while since we'd had something like that. Obamacare launched the night before, the day before the caucus system. So the people that showed up to caucus night were very mad about Obamacare and about those policies that they weren't very interested in. But we're not far off from the pendulum swinging the other way. And you've been around the process long enough. And I think there will be more issues. And as technology and all these other things keep up and the government continues to monitor things we're doing, you see bipartisan interest in an issue like that, which is interesting because now we're all united. Well, we're not necessarily sure we want government listening to everything we're doing. We want some privacy. We think that's protected in the Constitution. So that could be an issue that swings the pendulum towards another direction. And I think, and you've seen this, I'm sure, copious times over your career, that this pendulum swings all over the place all the time. And it's good. It's natural. And it's healthy for America. And I think at the end of the day, our identity gets stronger every time we make a decision about something. We get better, right? And so I would just argue, instead of getting frustrated as we hyper-focus on one problem as an endemic issue and try and solve them from even a lawmaker's perspective, I worry that we sometimes make the problem worse 10 years later with the solutions we get involved. That is simply, we've seen it over and over and over again from one issue to another where legislative action or whatever didn't necessarily solve the problem we were hoping it would.
I'd just say that the questioner hit the nail on the head, and that is vigorous elections draw interest and will create the kind of political tension that you're referencing here, the political tension that we need to make good decisions, and it's been woefully missing.
I just want to make a comment to that before I get to what I really came up here for. On election day last time, I took an elderly gentleman with me to vote. I never asked him who he was voting for, and he never asked me any questions, so I didn't tell him anything. I figured if he wanted information, he'd ask for it. So after he voted and I took him home, his son asked him, well, who did you vote for? And he told him. And he said, how come you voted for them? What was it about them that you liked? Oh, I don't know anything about any of them. I just vote on name recognition. And I think that's what you get across the board a lot of times is people vote on
It's good to be a
recognition.
McKay in Weber County, Davis County. You're absolutely right. I should run up.
So anyway, last year when Count My Vote was going around getting their signatures, I happened to go to the grocery store, and there was someone in the parking lot with a clipboard, and she came up to me, and she was telling me about this. She's getting signatures for this Count My Vote ballot initiative, and she had no idea who she was talking to, and so I just kept asking her questions, and she kept telling me lie after lie after lie. She told me that within each county, they only have 10 to 15 delegates. And these 10 to 15 delegates, they make decisions for everybody. They decide what money is going to go to parks, what money is going to go to school lunches. And I kept giving her opportunities to come clean on it. I said, don't you think it's the legislators that decide that? Oh, no, it's these delegates. And it's the same people that run time after time. And I said, well, how do you become a delegate? She says, well, they have these things called caucuses, and you come to them, but the old delegates, they just vote themselves in. So you can't become a delegate because they just keep voting themselves in. And I'm telling you, I've got like 20 minutes of conversation with this gal. I recorded it. Oh, yeah, I did. And she lied to me time after time, and I got her name, and I went down to Weber County, and I looked through the records of all the signatures on the witness signatures when they turned them in. Her name was nowhere to be found. And, I have to agree with Representative McKay. This Count My Vote initiative, it was very fraudulent and very dishonest.
I'm just going to stick up for you real quick, Rich, just for a second. Then that way you don't have to do it yourself, maybe. It seems better. I know that the founders of Count My Vote and those that were involved in gathering the petition had nothing but integrity in mind when they put together the process and they put together. I do know that there were probably, and I can only imagine, I supervise employees in my job, and sometimes things get said that I would prefer not be said, and I'm sure I say things that bother them as well. I think that for the most part, people tried to do the right thing, and maybe it was lack of training, or maybe it was whatever, but I know that I know myself that Rich McEwen, Mike Levitt, and Gail Miller, and all of those that were involved in the petition, anytime they were describing the process, they did their best to keep it filled with integrity. So I'm just going to stick up for them for just a minute, even though I really don't like them at all. No, I'm completely kidding. No, I mean, in all honesty, I think they attempted to the best of their ability, as much as you've got to ramp up a small citizen force and even paid force to try and put together a petition. It is impossible to try and get everything through to everybody that they would like to have done. And your concern, though, I think, hits with everyone's concern on petitions generally is, will people just sign things because they're being asked to? Someone told me one time that in Utah we care more about being nice than being truthful. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but if someone came up to me and asked me for a signature on something and it was somebody I personally knew or they seemed really friendly, I could see a signature being granted whether or not that person was, or whether or not it was an issue I agreed on. So I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm not qualifying one way or the other. I just wanted to stick up for Rich so that he didn't have to do it himself.
Let's go to our last questioner.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Sharp. I'm from Davis County and representing nobody. I am a state central committee member for the Republican Party, and I've been a delegate for the past 8 years. I'm so glad that you guys were here today. I have a lot of questions about this initiative and don't really know 100% on where I stand with SB 54. I still have a lot of questions after today. I keep hearing apathy being an issue, but have we done any polling to see where the voter apathy lies? What is the impotence behind the lack of participation in our voter poll in Utah? That might be something great for Dan Jones to take a look at. I do think there's value in data, polls, and information, and I think it's a great resource to at least have information to go forward from. I worked on Senator Hatch's campaign, and I do have to say that I was responsible to get a third of the state out to vote and participate in that campaign. And there are problems within our caucus system that I would have to acknowledge, and I think that the party has come forward and has worked to remedy some of those issues, but not all of them. And I would like to see more information on that. And the last thing I'd like to leave a question and maybe urge Representative McKay. I believe you know in 2012 in the general session, I asked Representative Stuart Barlow to run an education amendment to provide information to graduating seniors on what the political process is in our state. And that was quickly killed before it even made it to the floor for discussion. I would like to encourage us that if we're concerned about the political process and engaging people, that we work on that issue, because it's important that we get voters information on how to participate in the process that we have, regardless of what that process is. So less of a question,
Duly
more of a
noted.
plea. Thanks.
We wanted to thank all of the panelists that spent their time here today. If you'd give them a round of applause. Thank you.
And I would also, in addition to thanking all of the panelists for an enlightening discussion, I'd like to thank our moderator as well, Senator Jones.